On a night in 1959, the largest house on Cumberland Island, Georgia, the 59-room mansion the Carnegie family had named Dungeness, was on fire, and no one was coming to save it. The nearest fire company sat on the mainland across a sound that no bridge had ever crossed. The house had already stood dark and empty, its rooms stripped and its shutters closed for more than 30 years, and the family that raised it, heirs to one of the largest steel fortunes ever assembled in America, was scattered or gone or simply unwilling to come. Thomas Carnegie, the younger brother and business partner of the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, had built that house for his wife Lucy in the 1880s. Lucy had gone on to hold almost the whole island, 5 great mansions, a private village of some 200 servants, an estate strung along most of an 18-mile island, and bound, after her death, by a will so strict that for 46 years not 1 acre of it could be sold. Chapter 1. No one is coming. The fire was thorough. By morning the roof was gone and the great rooms had fallen in on themselves, and what stood in the grey light was a shell of brick and blackened tabby, open to the weather, where a steel fortune had once wintered. In the years before, the family had asked what it might cost to simply pull the ruinous house down, and had found even that beyond them. The demolition bid came back at some $15,000, and there was no living Carnegie left on the island with both the money and the will to pay it. So the house had been left to stand and wait. The people who watched the orange glow from the mainland understood that something enormous had ended. Fewer of them knew that the ground beneath those walls had done this once before. The Carnegie Dungeness was not the first great mansion to burn to its foundations on that exact spot. It was the second. What the family had made there while the money lasted is worth setting down plainly. They owned most of the largest barrier island on the coast of Georgia, a place close to 18 miles from end to end. They raised 5 mansions on the sand and the shell rock. The main house alone held 59 rooms and more than 35,000 square feet beneath one roof, topped by a tower 100 feet high. They kept a working village of roughly 200 servants and gardeners and hands. They sank an artesian well to keep a lawn green on an island in the sea, cut carriage roads beneath the live oaks and the Spanish moss, and stabled scores of horses for riding and hunting and show. The household came down each autumn by rail and by steamer, October to spring, in the years when Dungeness was full. And when the matriarch died, her will closed a hand around all of it from beyond the grave, untouchable and unsellable, for the better part of half a century. All of it is gone now, or feral, or in the hands of strangers. The mansions stand empty, or burned, or sold away. Today, the roofless shell of Dungeness is the most photographed place on the island, and the horses that graze against its walls are the reason many people come at all. Those horses are the descendants of the Carnegies' own carriage stock, and they run loose across the dunes to this day, the only unmanaged herd on the entire Atlantic coast, unfed, unfenced, and belonging to no one. How a fortune that enormous came to abandon its own palace to the dark. How that palace came to burn, and by whose hand, and why, 60 years after the fire, wild horses would be the only living things moving through the ruins of Dungeness. These are the questions the fire did not answer. It ended only the part of the story that could still be seen. To understand that fire, it is necessary to go back long before the Carnegies ever saw Cumberland, to an island that had already made ruins of powerful men and buried more than one of them in its sand. By the time Thomas Carnegie bought the land in 1881, the first great house to carry the name Dungeness was already a blackened ruin and had been for 15 years. The Carnegies cleared away its bones and built their palace directly on top of it. The island had a long memory and a longer habit of taking back whatever was raised on it. The family would spend 3 generations learning what the island already knew. Chapter 2. The First Ruin. The first person to build a great house on that ground was not a Carnegie and was not a man. Catherine Littlefield Greene, the widow of the Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene, had already done something that would reshape the country more thoroughly than any mansion. In the 1790s, on a plantation near Savannah, she took in a young Yale graduate named Eli Whitney and encouraged, funded, and by some accounts, helped refine the machine he was building, a device to comb the seeds from cotton. The cotton gin remade the American South. It turned a stubborn crop into the most profitable commodity in the country and drove the expansion of slavery across half a continent. Catherine Greene backed the machine that would enrich nearly everyone who came after her on that island. She herself never grew rich from it. The Greenes had come to Cumberland by way of a debt. Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's ablest generals, had been granted some 11,000 acres of the island in 1783, in settlement of a bad loan he had guaranteed for the army. He began cutting the island's live oaks, the dense, curved timber the Navy prized for the hulls of its warships, and died in 1786 before he could build. The land and the debts passed to Catherine. By 1800, remarried to her plantation manager Phineas Miller, and driven off the mainland by failure and unpaid taxes, she came to the island to begin again for the 3rd time in her life. On a Timucuan shell mound at the southern end, she and Miller raised a 4-story tabby house, 68 feet tall, its base walls 6 feet thick, with 16 fireplaces and 12 acres of gardens. She named it Dungeness, after an old hunting lodge General Oglethorpe had kept on the island decades before. It was among the grandest houses on the Georgia coast, and it was built and worked by more than 200 enslaved people who planted the Sea Island cotton that paid for it. The island began collecting its dead almost at once. Not long after the house was raised, Phineas Miller pricked his finger on a thorn while gathering plants for those gardens, and died of the infection at 39. Catherine outlived him by more than a decade and died in 1814. Her gravestone in the family cemetery recorded, without irony, that she possessed great talents and exalted virtues. The plantation passed to her daughter, Louisa Shaw. In between, the house had already served a foreign army. During the War of 1812, British troops occupied the island and used Dungeness as their headquarters, and when they left, hundreds of enslaved people from the island and the surrounding coast left with them as free people. That was a thread the island would pick up again. 4 years later, in the spring of 1818, a ship put a dying man ashore at Dungeness. He was Henry Lee, called Light Horse Harry, once a cavalry hero of the Revolution, once the governor of Virginia, the man who had eulogized George Washington as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. He had since lost all of it. Ruined by land speculation, jailed for debt, half-crippled by a political mob in Baltimore, he had spent his last years wandering the Caribbean in a failing search for his health. Louisa Shaw, the daughter of his old commander, took him in. He died that spring and was buried in the family plot, with guns fired in his honor from an American warship anchored in the Sound. His son would come looking for the grave twice. The first time, in 1862, Robert E. Lee was inspecting Confederate coastal defenses. He found the stone, he wrote to his wife, marked by a plain marble slab. In 1913, the body was dug up and carried north to Virginia to lie beside that son. Only the original headstone stayed behind. The house itself did not outlast the men it had buried by much. In 1866, the first Dungeness burned. No one rebuilt it. For 15 years it stood open to the sky at the south end of the island, a picturesque ruin that steamer passengers pointed to from the water, a monument to a revolutionary fortune the island had quietly taken back. It was still standing in that state, blackened and roofless, when a new kind of American money came looking for it. Not the old gentry of generals and governors, but industrial wealth, a fortune hammered out of iron and steel in the mills of Pittsburgh. The man who came to buy the ruin was a Carnegie. He was not, however, the Carnegie whose name the country knew. Chapter 3. The Other Brother. Andrew Carnegie's name is cut into the stone of some 2,500 libraries around the world, along with concert halls, universities, and a foundation that is still giving away his money a century after his death. His younger brother's name is on almost nothing. There was a blast furnace in Pittsburgh that once carried it, and for a few short years there was an island. Thomas Morrison Carnegie was the brother who stayed behind the desk while Andrew built the legend, and he is the one who bought Cumberland. The two had come up out of the same one-room weaver's cottage in Dunfermline, Scotland, and the same steerage passage to Pennsylvania in 1848, when Thomas was 5. Their father, a hand-loom weaver, had been ruined by the power looms that came to Scotland, and the family had crossed the ocean close to penniless. Andrew, 8 years the elder, became the promoter and the salesman, the man forever off in New York or London, raising money and raising his own name. Thomas ran the mills. He kept the books, managed the partners, and carried the daily grind of turning ore into rail while his brother traveled. By most accounts, it wore on him. He drank. The partnership with Andrew, who could be domineering and slow to share credit, was a hard one, and Thomas bore the weight of it in Pittsburgh while Andrew took the glory everywhere else. He had married well and happily. Lucy Coleman was the daughter of William Coleman, a Pittsburgh ironmaster and one of the Carnegies' own business partners, and Thomas met her through the firm. They married in June of 1866 and would have 9 children. When the brothers built their first blast furnace from the ground up in 1871, they named it the Lucy after her. It became one of the most productive furnaces in the country, and it carried the name of the woman for whom Thomas would one day buy a burned mansion on a Georgia island. The scale of the machine that made the family's money is worth pausing on. The mill Thomas helped run, the Edgar Thomson Works, opened in 1875 and could roll 1,600 tons of steel rail a month, cutting the price of a ton from $100 in iron to under $40 in steel. In 1881, the brothers folded their furnaces and mills into a single firm worth close to $5 million, of which Thomas held roughly a sixth. Within 20 years, the Carnegie Works would pour more steel than every mill in Great Britain combined. And when the empire was finally sold, in 1901, the price was $480 million, rolled into a new company capitalized at nearly $1.5 billion in a year when the entire federal government spent about $500 million. Thomas Carnegie did not live to see almost any of it. What he had come to want, more than steel or money, was to be somewhere else. He found the somewhere else in a magazine. Around 1880, the family read a magazine article describing a wild, half-forgotten barrier island on the coast of Georgia, and the next winter they came down to see it, sailing in through the little port of Fernandina, Florida, and crossing to the island's south end. They found live oaks hung with moss, a ruined tabby tower standing open to the sky, and near total silence. Thomas was enchanted. In 1881, he bought the Dungeness tract, 1,891 acres at the island's southern end, the blackened ruin of Catherine Greene's mansion among them, from a former Confederate general named William Davis, a first cousin of Jefferson Davis, for $35,000. He bought it as a gift for Lucy and the children and as a door out. Within a few years, he and a partner would add the old Stafford plantation, more than 8,000 acres, and the family would go on buying until it held nearly the whole island. He did not ask, or did not mind, why the island's owners never seemed to keep it long. Every family that had raised something grand on that ground, the Greenes, the Millers, the Staffords, had watched the island outlast them. Thomas Carnegie meant to be the exception. He would tear the ruin down and raise a far larger house on the same foundations, a winter palace where a worn-out steelman could finally rest. The house would be built. Whether Thomas Carnegie would ever truly live in it was a question the island had answered more than once already, and was about to answer again. Chapter 4. The Builder Falls. The house that rose on the ashes of Catherine Greene's tower did not look as though it belonged on a Georgia sea island at all. It looked as though it had been lifted whole out of the Scottish Highlands the Carnegies had left as poor children and set down among the palmettos and the salt marsh. Turrets, stone, a tower 100 feet high. Construction began in 1884. The workmen cleared away the blackened tabby of the old Dungeness, the ruin that had stood open to the weather for 18 years, and on the very same ground they raised a baronial castle for a steel man and his wife. Every beam and brick and pane of glass had to be carried across the Sound by boat, because there was no bridge to the island then, and there is none now. The house was finished in 1885. Thomas had come south for his health, away from the coal smoke of Pittsburgh, a city one visitor had called hell with the lid taken off, and for a brief season it must have seemed the plan had worked. The tired brother, the domineering partner, the mills, the smoke, all of it left behind, and in their place a warm island, a new castle, and Lucy and the children around him. The reprieve was brief. In the autumn of 1886, Andrew Carnegie caught typhoid fever at the family's retreat in the Pennsylvania mountains and came very close to dying. About a week later, in Pittsburgh, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. He had never been strong, and years of drinking had left him weaker than his age. His own brother later acknowledged that the drink had helped carry him off. He declined fast. On the 19th of October, 1886, at the family's Homewood house in Pittsburgh, Thomas Morrison Carnegie died. He was 43. He left Lucy a widow with 9 children, the eldest 19, the youngest 5. The grief did not come alone. Their mother, Margaret, old and already failing, had 2 sons lying gravely ill at the same hour, and when one of them died, she could not be told, for fear the news would kill her. It did not have to. 3 weeks after Thomas, on the 11th of November, Margaret Carnegie died as well. Andrew, still too weak to bear it, was told of neither his brother's death nor his mother's for the better part of a month. He surfaced slowly out of his own fever into a world that had quietly removed both of them while he lay insensible. In the space of 3 weeks, the family that had come out of a one-room weaver's cottage in Dunfermline had lost the mother who raised them and the brother who ran their mills. Thomas was buried first in Pittsburgh, in Allegheny Cemetery, far from the island he had bought as a refuge. But Lucy did not leave him there. In time, she carried him south and laid him in the small family cemetery on Cumberland, in the same ground that held the Greenes and the Millers, a short walk from where Light Horse Harry Lee had lain for most of a century. The island had taken another one. Thomas Carnegie had meant to be the exception to its long habit, and instead he had become the newest name in its oldest story. A man of means who built something grand on Cumberland and did not live to enjoy it. Lucy Coleman Carnegie was left, not yet 40, with 9 children, an unfinished paradise, half of one of the last wild islands on the Atlantic coast, and a 1/6 share in what was fast becoming the largest steel empire on Earth. Her brother-in-law Andrew, recovering in the North, made a reasonable assumption about what would happen next. She was a grieving widow with, as far as anyone knew, no head for business. She would sell him Thomas's shares, take the money, and leave the running of the firm to the men who understood it. That was the natural order of things, and Andrew Carnegie had built an empire on his sense of what people could be expected to do. In the single matter of his brother's widow, that sense failed him completely. Lucy had no intention of selling anything. She was about to spend the next 30 years proving how badly the family had underestimated her, and turning a dead man's winter retreat into a kingdom of her own. Chapter 5. The Widow Refuses. Andrew Carnegie offered his brother's widow a fair price for the shares. She said no, and she went on saying no year after year, while the men around her waited for the grieving woman to come to her senses and be bought out. She never was. Lucy Coleman Carnegie held on to every share Thomas had left her, learned the business well enough to manage it herself, and over the next 3 decades grew the family's slice of the Carnegie fortune rather than spending it down. It was the first thing almost everyone got wrong about her, and it would not be the last. She was the daughter of an ironmaster, William Coleman, and she had grown up around the furnaces and ledgers of industrial Pittsburgh. The business was not as foreign to her as Andrew assumed. When her brother-in-law finally sold the whole steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, Lucy's retained stake paid out with it. She did not use the money to leave the island behind. She used it to buy more of the island. The house Thomas had left her was only a beginning. His mansion of 1885, designed by a Pittsburgh architect, was a large Queen Anne pile with a 100-foot tower, and Lucy spent the following years enlarging it, wing by wing, into the turreted castle whose ruins still stand. By the end, it held 59 rooms. She put a power plant on the island to light it and an ice plant to cool it, on a barrier island with no bridge and no town, where every ton of coal and every length of pipe had to come across the water by boat. She sank the wells, laid the roads, and ran the whole operation as a business, a plantation, and a private nation at once. Consider the shape of what she assembled. She refused to sell a stake of roughly 1/6 in what became in 1901 the largest steel corporation on Earth, and instead poured its dividends back into sand and marsh and forest. She bought until, at her death, she owned some 16,000 acres of Cumberland, the largest holding on the island by far, on a barrier island nearly 18 miles long. She enlarged one mansion to 59 rooms and would build 4 more. She wired an island that had no electricity and iced an island that had no refrigeration. And in 1894, after petitioning until the members relented, she became the first woman ever admitted to the New York Yacht Club, flying its flag from the deck of her own 115-foot steam yacht, which she had named, of course, the Dungeness. That yacht is worth pausing on because it says something about her. A widow of the 1880s was expected to wear black, keep house, and defer to her late husband's brother. Lucy Carnegie captained a steam yacht up and down the Atlantic coast, raced it, filled it with guests, and hunted the island's forests with a gun she knew how to use. Her obituary, years later, would remember her plainly as a keen hunter. She was not performing grief for anyone. She was running a kingdom, and it was, by the standards of the age, an almost feudal one. The island had a lord, and the lord was a woman. It had a great house, a fleet, a power plant, a private cemetery, and a population that answered to her. What it did not yet have was the thing Lucy wanted most, which was her children settled around her, close enough to see from her own windows for the rest of her life. She had 9 of them. She had more land than any one family could use, and more money than they could easily spend. And so she set out to do what almost no American fortune had tried before or since, to plant every child on the same island in a house she would build for each of them, and to bind them to the place so tightly that not one of them would ever have to leave, or ever quite be able to. It was an act of love, and it would prove to be a kind of sentence. The mansions she was about to raise for her sons and daughters would give the Carnegies the most gilded decades the island ever saw. They would also fix the family in place when the time came that it should have scattered, and they would still be standing, most of them, long after the money that built them was gone. Lucy meant to make Cumberland a home her children could never lose. She succeeded better than she knew, and it cost them more than she could have guessed. Chapter 6. The Gilded Cage. By the turn of the century, there was an indoor swimming pool on Cumberland Island. There was a squash court with a vaulted gallery for spectators, an elevator, heated towel racks, and a crude system of cooled air pumped up from the basement. All of it stood inside a single mansion on a barrier island with no bridge, no town, and no electrical grid but the one the family had built for itself. The house was called Plum Orchard, and it was a wedding present. Lucy Carnegie had it raised in 1898 for her son George and his bride Margaret Thaw, and she hired Peabody and Stearns, the Boston firm that designed palaces for the Gilded Age rich, to build it. What they produced was a Georgian revival mansion of some 22,000 square feet, 30 main rooms, that could stand beside the summer cottages of Newport, set down in the middle of a Georgia wilderness and reachable only by boat. It cost around $50,000 at a time when a working man's wage might be $1 or $2 a day, and it was, by design, one of the most modern houses in America. Plum Orchard was one of several. For her daughter Margaret, called Retta, Lucy built Grayfield, a colonial revival house that still stands and still takes guests, run to this day by Carnegie descendants as the only inn on the island. For her eldest son, William, who never married, there was the rebuilt Stafford, raised on the ground of the old cotton barons' plantation. And beside Dungeness itself, Lucy put up a 30-room house she called, with some understatement, the cottage, for one of her sons, and set it so that his bedroom window faced hers across the lawn. By one account, when she raised her shades in the morning, it was the signal that he might come and read with her until noon. She had built her children houses from which they could watch for her. Around the great houses grew a private town. To keep the estate running, and to keep it self-sufficient, the Carnegies kept a working village of roughly 200 people: gardeners, carpenters, cooks, laundresses, boatmen, dairymen, farmhands. There were something like 40 outbuildings, barns and stables and workshops, a dairy, gardens and greenhouses that fed the family, and the power plant and ice plant Lucy had installed. The island grew much of its own food, made its own light, and answered to a single household. It was less an estate than a small country, with a population, an economy, and a queen. The family's days were filled with the amusements of the very rich. There was the golf and the tennis, the pool and the squash court, the hunting Lucy loved, and her steam yacht riding at anchor in the Sound. And there were horses, a great many of them, kept for the carriages that ran the island's roads, for riding and for the hunt. The Carnegies stabled them, bred them, and drove them under the live oaks. Some of them, in time, would slip their fences and their keepers and go loose into the forest and the dunes, and their descendants are running there still, though that is a later part of the story. Set the whole of it down together, and the scale comes clear. 5 great mansions on one island, a single wedding present house of some 22,000 square feet and 30 rooms, with an indoor pool and an elevator, built for around $50,000. A working village of 200 servants and hands, some 40 outbuildings, a dairy, greenhouses, a golf course, and a private power plant, all on an island a boat ride from the nearest road. And at the top of it, a widow and her 9 children, wintering in castles their mother had built, so that not one of them would ever have to leave her. This was the height of it, the 2 gilded decades on either side of 1900, when Cumberland was as grand as any private place in America. But the island the Carnegies saw from their verandas was only one of the islands on that shore. Beneath the golf course and the ice plant and the squash gallery lay another Cumberland entirely, older and poorer and far more haunted, a place of shell-mound graves and burned slave cabins, and a small congregation of freed people and their children living at the north end in a world the Carnegie children rarely entered. The family had bought the land. They had not bought its history, and no amount of money could build over what had already happened on it. Chapter 7. Slaves and Heirs. For 8 weeks in the winter of 1815, the British flag flew over Dungeness, and enslaved people ran toward it. This was the first Dungeness, Catherine Green's Tabby Tower, decades before the Carnegies took the name for a house of their own. During the War of 1812, a British fleet under Rear Admiral George Cockburn, the same officer who had burned the city of Washington the year before, seized Cumberland Island and made the mansion his headquarters. And Cockburn's forces carried a proclamation: any enslaved person who could reach the British lines would go free. They came. Across rivers and marshes and open water, from plantations up and down the Georgia coast, more than 1,500 enslaved men, women, and children made their way to Cumberland Island and left it as free people, carried off on British warships to Bermuda, to Trinidad, to Halifax in Nova Scotia. When American agents arrived at Dungeness in March of 1815, waving a copy of the newly signed Treaty of Ghent and demanding the return of what they called their property, Cockburn refused them. One of them, a Georgia planter named Thomas Spaulding, could only report back, with what he called much regret, that the people he had come to reclaim were already on board the Regulus, sailing for freedom. The British withdrew in the middle of that march. For 8 weeks, the ground on which the Carnegies would one day raise their winter palace had been a gate out of slavery. It was the exception. For most of its history before the Carnegies, Cumberland was a cotton island worked by the enslaved. By 1860, more than 500 enslaved people lived there, outnumbering the free white residents 7-1, across more than a dozen plantations. The largest belonged to Robert Stafford, who had been born on the island, worked his way up from Louisa Shaw's plantation, and come to own some 8,000 acres and 350 human beings. Stafford's story complicates the simple version of it. He never married, but he fathered 6 children with an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Bernaday, called Zabet. Rather than keep those children in bondage, he sent them north to Groton, Connecticut, before the Civil War, paid for their education, and set up trusts that supported them long after his death. One of his daughters became one of the first black women in America to earn a medical degree. The popular story that Stafford died and left them nothing is not, according to the historian who studied his records most closely, true. What he left on the island itself was starker. A quarter-mile from his house stand the chimneys, some 24 brick hearths, all that remains of the cabins where the people he owned had lived. The great houses of Cumberland have their ruins. So do the people who built them. When freedom finally came for good, many of the formerly enslaved did not leave. In 1893, at the north end of the island, a group of them bought small plots of land outright and founded a community they called simply the settlement, among the first pieces of ground owned by former slaves anywhere in the country. They farmed it, and on it they built a small log church, the first African Baptist church, which still stands. It sits about 14 miles up the island from Dungeness, at the opposite end from everything the Carnegies built, which is roughly the distance the 2 Cumberlands kept from one another, because at the same hour that the freed families of the settlement were clearing their own land and raising their own church at the north end, the sons of Thomas and Lucy Carnegie were coming of age at the south end, in a manner almost no one on the island would have foreseen a generation earlier. It was said of them, and not without cause, that scarcely one of Thomas and Lucy's 6 sons ever held a paying job in his life. They did not need to. The family that had climbed out of a Scottish weaver's cottage on the strength of 2 brothers who worked without rest now raised a generation who would never have to work at all. The Gilded Island and the Freedmen's Island shared one thing, though neither could quite see it. Both rested, in the end, on a fortune made far away in Pittsburgh, and on the will of the woman who now held nearly all of Cumberland in a single hand. Lucy Carnegie had built her children a world. She had not yet settled what would become of it when she was gone. When she finally did settle it, in a document signed a few years before her death, she would bind the island and everyone on it more tightly than any of them understood, and the binding would hold for close to half a century after she was in the ground. Chapter 8. The Dead Hand. Lucy Coleman Carnegie died on the 16th of January, 1916, of pneumonia, in her sleep. She was buried in the small family cemetery on Cumberland, beside the husband she had carried back to the island to lie near the Greens and the Millers and the empty plot where Light Horse Harry Lee had once lain. She was gone, and yet, in a way few of the living ever manage, she remained entirely in charge of the island. 4 years earlier, in 1912, Lucy had signed a will, and it was, by every account, an extraordinary document. It left her 9 children, the island, and the fortune that ran it, but it left them on terms. Under the trust she created, the Carnegie lands and mansions could not be freely sold, and the island could not be divided while any of her 9 children still lived. Not one of them could cash out. Not one could break off a piece and walk away. To do anything with the island at all required all of them to act together, for as long as any of them drew breath. She had meant it, she said, to keep the family whole and the island theirs. What she had built was a cage with a very long lease. She had thought about the money, too. The estate had never truly paid for itself, It was a money-losing farm and playground that the family's managers tried, at various times, to run as a business they could write their losses against. To keep a place that produced almost nothing and cost a great deal, Lucy had bought an office building in Pittsburgh so that its rents, along with the steel dividends, would flow south and keep the island running after she was gone. When the county later tried to raise the taxes on the estate, the Carnegies protested that they brought business and labor to the region, though in truth they imported most of their staff and their supplies from the north. It was a careful plan, made by a careful woman, and it rested on one assumption, that the money would keep coming. Consider what the will held in its grip. 9 children, bound to one another and to a single place, some 16,000 acres, nearly the whole of an 18-mile island that could be neither sold nor split. A trust, signed in 1912, that would not loosen its hold until the last of the 9 was dead. That release came in 1962, 46 years after Lucy herself was buried, when her last surviving child, Florence, died at last, and the restrictions fell away. Only then, in 1965, was the island finally divided among the grandchildren and their heirs, of whom there were by then a great many, though only 5 of the 9 children had left children of their own. For 46 years, a dead woman's signature governed one of the largest privately held islands in America. While the fortune held, all of this read as devotion. One of Lucy's grandsons, looking back, said only that to accomplish what she had on Cumberland, she had to be strong-willed. She was. But strong will has a way of outliving the conditions that once justified it. Lucy had bound her children to the island at the very height of the family's wealth, when Cumberland was a paradise, and the money to run it seemed without end. She had written no escape into the will for the day the money ran short, and that day was coming faster than anyone at Dungeness cared to see. The generation that inherited the island had never built a fortune, and did not entirely know how to keep one. The steel dividends that had raised the place were being split among more and more heirs, and spent faster than they arrived. The rents from one Pittsburgh office building could not carry an island of 5 mansions and 200 servants. Within a decade of Lucy's death, the plain arithmetic of Cumberland had turned against the family that owned it. The castles still stood. The yacht still rode at anchor in the Sound. But the money that kept all of it afloat was beginning, very slowly, to drain away, and the will that was meant to protect the Carnegies had bolted them to the deck of a ship that was already, quietly, beginning to sink. Chapter 9. The Fortune Drains. The last time the great house at Dungeness was lit for a party, it was for a wedding. In 1929, a Carnegie daughter was married there, and for one evening the vast rooms filled again with light and music and guests. It was the last time. Within months the stock market collapsed, and the house that had taken a steel fortune to build went dark for good. The money had been turning against the family for years by then. Lucy's trust carried her 9 children comfortably through the first decade after her death, on the rents from the Pittsburgh building, some stocks, and whatever the island's farm could bring in. But there were more heirs every year, and less to divide among them. By 1925, once the cost of running the island had been paid, each surviving child's share of the year's income had fallen to about $32,000. It was still a great deal of money. It was also a sliver of what they had grown up with, a family reduced, as one history puts it, to making deals for tens of thousands where their parents had dealt in millions. They tried to make the island pay, logging its timber, running cattle, leasing the hunting. None of it came close to covering what Cumberland cost. At one point they came near to letting the island be strip-mined. Nothing worked because the island had never been a business. It had always been a way of spending money, and the money was running out. So in 1925, the family shut Dungeness. The largest house on the island, the seat of the entire estate, was simply closed up to spare the expense of keeping it open. The wedding 4 years later was a brief reprieve, a last flare of the old life. And after the crash, the Carnegies gave the place up altogether and let it stand empty. And then, across the years that followed, they took it apart. Not all at once, but piece by valuable piece. The olive wood floors and paneling were pulled out and carried off to build a yacht. The marble mantels and fixtures were stripped from the fireplaces. The best of the furnishings were moved out to the other Carnegie houses, to Plum Orchard and Stafford and Grayfield, which were still lived in. Dungeness, the flagship, was quietly cannibalized to keep the rest of the fleet afloat until there was little left inside it but bare walls and empty rooms. The decay was not gentle. By the early 1950s, the roof was failing, the windows were gone, and termites had eaten through the frame. The private village that had once kept the estate alive had shrunk almost to nothing. Where Lucy had employed some 200 servants and hands, there were, by 1960, about 13 caretakers left to watch over the whole of it. The other houses were emptying too. George Lauder Carnegie, given Plum Orchard as a wedding present, had died in 1921, still in his 40s. His widow sold off its gold fixtures and finest pieces, shipped them north to be auctioned, then married a French count and left for Africa. The cottage, the 30-room house Lucy had built beside Dungeness, burned in 1949, set alight by accident by one of her grandsons. The heirs who remained kept more and more to the mainland in Georgia and New York, and came to the island less and less. House by house, the place was beginning to take the Carnegies' mansions back, the way it had taken every mansion raised on it before. For 34 years, the great house stood empty in the dark. It was too costly to keep, and under the terms of Lucy's will, it could not be sold. The family had even priced out tearing it down and found even that too dear to bother with. So it was left where it stood, stripped and rotting and waiting, at the south end of an island almost no one visited anymore. It could not fall down fast enough to suit anyone, and it could not be gotten rid of. It only waited, year after year, for something to come and finish it. On a night in 1959, something did. Chapter 10. The Night It Burned. What came was fire. On a night in 1959, the empty shell of Dungeness caught, and there was no one on the island to stop it, and no way to bring help across the water in time. The nearest fire company sat on the mainland at St. Mary's, beyond a sound that had never been bridged. So the house was left to burn, and burn it did, for 3 days. The flames stood so high that people saw the glow from the mainland, miles off across the water, an entire Gilded Age going up at the south end of a dark island. By the time it was over, there was nothing left to save, which was fitting, because there had been nothing worth saving inside for years. The roof fell in. The upper floors came down into the cellars. The turrets and the 100-foot tower and the 59 rooms burned down to their brick and their tabby, and what stood at the end was the roofless blackened shell that stands there still. There was, in truth, no one left with the money or the will to have saved it, even if the water had been at hand. No living Carnegie with a real stake in Cumberland had the fortune it would have taken to restore a 59-room mansion, and the family had already decided, in every way that counted, to let it go. What the fire took that night, the Carnegies had been quietly giving away for 30 years. No one ever established for certain how the fire began. It was called suspicious, an arson, and a mystery, and it was none of those things officially because no cause was ever proved and no one was ever charged. But a story came down with the ashes, and it is the story people still tell. Some weeks before the fire, the account goes, a caretaker had caught a man poaching deer on Carnegie land and shot him in the leg. The poacher was carried off to a hospital on the mainland, and when he had healed, the story goes, he came back to settle it, sank one of the family's yachts at its mooring, and put a torch to the great house the Carnegies no longer wanted and could no longer sell. Whether any of that is true, no one can now say. The people who knew are gone, and the house that might have held the evidence burned to the ground. The fire kept its own secret, which was the one thing about Dungeness that had always been certain. The island did not explain itself. It was the second time. 93 years after Catherine Green's Tabby Tower had burned to a ruin on that exact ground, the mansion the Carnegies raised on top of it burned to a ruin in the same place. 2 great houses, 2 fires, 1 foundation. The island had a way of returning the powerful to the same handful of ash, and it had now done it to the Greens and the Carnegies alike, on the identical patch of sand at the south end. The fire was the visible end of the Carnegie century on Cumberland, the moment the grandest thing the family ever built stopped being a house and became a ruin for strangers to photograph. But the island itself did not burn. 90% of it still belonged to the Carnegies, still locked inside Lucy's will, still held in common by her aging children, who could not sell it, could not divide it, and were dying off one by one. In 3 years, the last of them would be gone, and the lock that had held the island shut for close to half a century would finally spring open, and when it did, Cumberland would face the most dangerous threat in its long history, more dangerous than any fire, in the shape of a man with a plan and a checkbook, and every intention of turning the whole wild place into a resort. Chapter 11. The developer arrives. Of Lucy Carnegie's 9 children, the last to die was her 7th, Florence, whom the family called Floss. She had been married on the steps of Dungeness in 1901, in the mansion's brightest years, and she had come back to the island in old age to live at the Grange, the former overseer's house. She kept her late husband's ashes in an urn on the mantelpiece, and when her grandnieces and grandnephews came to visit, she would invite them, gently, to come and see my husband. On the night in June of 1959 that Dungeness burned, Florence watched the great house of her girlhood go up in flame, and by the family's account she wept without stopping and never entirely came back from it. When she died in 1962, something larger than one woman ended with her. The last of Lucy's children was gone, and with her went the lock on the island. For 46 years, Lucy's will had held Cumberland shut. Now, with the death of the final sibling, the trust dissolved. In 1965, the island was divided at last among the grandchildren and their heirs, who were free, for the first time since 1916, to do as they pleased with their portions. There were many of them, each holding a slice of an island, and most of them were land-rich and, by Carnegie standards, cash-poor. The old fortune had thinned across 3 generations. What the heirs had was acreage, and acreage on a wild and beautiful barrier island in the 1960s was worth a great deal to the right buyer. The right buyer appeared almost at once. In 1968, 3 of the heirs, Andrew Carnegie III, Thomas Carnegie IV, and Henry Carter Carnegie, sold their land, about a fifth of everything the family held, to Charles Fraser for a little over $1.5 million. Fraser was not a hunter or a northern millionaire after a winter retreat. He was the most successful resort developer in the American Southeast, the man who had taken the wild timberland of Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and turned it into sea pines, the template on which a generation of coastal resorts was built. And he meant to do to Cumberland what he had done to Hilton Head. His plan, which he called Cumberland Oaks, would have covered the island with marinas and hotels, golf courses ringed by costly subdivisions, beachfront bars, and an airport large enough to land corporate jets. Within months, Fraser had set up a headquarters on the island at the place still called Sea Camp, and his crews were at work clearing his tract. The scale of what stood ready to happen is worth setting down. The last of 9 children had died in 1962, and in 1965, nearly 16,000 acres, close to the whole island, had passed to dozens of heirs free to sell. About 3,000 acres went to Fraser for a little over $1.5 million, roughly $500 an acre, in a single deal. And Fraser was no small operator. By 1971, his company had something on the order of 135,000 acres under development or planning across the coast. Hilton Head, when he first came to it, had been a wild island with no bridge. Within 15 years, he had turned it into one of the busiest resorts on the Atlantic seaboard. That was the future rolling toward Cumberland on the treads of his machines. The Carnegie descendants were, in the word of one account, incensed. The island their grandmother had bound them to for half a century, the wild place many of them had spent their lives both resenting and loving, was suddenly for sale, and the man buying into it was tearing down the forest to build an airstrip. They disliked Fraser personally. They disliked far more what he meant to do. But the family was split. Some heirs had already sold, and others meant to fight. There was a bitter irony in it that few of them can have missed. For half a century they had chafed against Lucy's will, against the lock that would not let them sell, or leave, or cash out. And the moment that lock finally sprang open, they found that it had been the one thing holding the island whole, the one thing standing between Cumberland and the bulldozers. Lucy's dead hand had been protecting the place all along. The Carnegies, who wanted to save the island, understood they could not do it by themselves. They no longer had the money to buy Fraser out, or to hold the line against the developer after him, and the one after that. So some of them, together with the Candler family of Coca-Cola, who owned the island's north end, went looking for the only partner large enough to stop what was coming. They went to the government of the United States. What they set in motion would save Cumberland from the bulldozers. It would also take the island away from the family for good. Chapter 12. The Last Fight. By the spring of 1970, Charles Fraser had bulldozers cutting roads and an airstrip through the forest at the north end of Cumberland, and the people who wanted to save the island understood that they were out of time. It was now or never. What formed against Fraser in those months was an unlikely alliance, and at its center were the Carnegies themselves, or the half of them who had decided that their grandmother's island should stay wild. They did not have the money to stop a developer of Fraser's size. What they had was a cause and a growing list of allies. Some of the Carnegie heirs and the Candler family, who held the North End, joined with the Georgia Conservancy, the Sierra Club, and the former Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, and found a champion in Congressman William Stuckey of coastal Georgia, who introduced a bill to make the whole island a national seashore. One Conservancy trustee told a congressional hearing that they wanted the place managed so that, in the language of the day, each visitation is a quality visitation, There was resistance to overcome. There had even been a proposal, seriously entertained, to strip mine large parts of the island for titanium. Camden County, which stood to lose its tax base, came around only when researchers estimated that visitors to the seashore would spend some $70 million in the region over its first 15 years. The state of Georgia lined up behind it, and slowly, against the clock and the bulldozers, the thing began to move. The last problem was the oldest one on the island: money. Passing a law was one matter. Buying an island from dozens of Carnegie heirs and one determined developer was another, and the government did not mean to pay for it alone. The rescue came from a familiar kind of source. The Andrew Mellon Foundation, built on another Gilded Age fortune out of the same Pittsburgh that had made the Carnegies, donated $7.5 million to the newly created National Park Foundation, which used it to buy the private land on Cumberland, Fraser's tract among it, and deed the whole of it to the United States. Fraser sold and carried off a 200-acre retained right at the spot he had made his headquarters, still called Sea Camp today. On the 23rd of October, 1972, President Richard Nixon signed the bill into law, and Cumberland Island became a national seashore, the property of the people of the United States. 10 years later, nearly 10,000 acres of it would be set aside as protected wilderness. The largest privately held island on the Georgia coast, the winter kingdom of one of the richest families in American history, had passed out of private hands for good. It was not a clean break, and it was never meant to be. The Carnegie heirs who sold did so on the condition that they could keep their houses and the land around them, not for the usual 25 years, but for 40 years, or for the lives of the owners and their spouses. A few would not sell at all. Lucy Ferguson, a granddaughter of the first Lucy, who had turned Grayfield into an inn, told the government she would never give up her land, and distrusted the Park Service to the end of her life. That is why, even now, the island is not entirely public. Grayfield is still a Carnegie inn. Stafford is still in the family. Descendants still live at the north and south ends of an island that belongs, on paper, to everyone. The family that could not keep the island, and could not sell it, and could not save it alone, was allowed to remain on it as tenants of the nation that had saved it for them. And so the great machine of the Carnegie estate wound down at last. The servants were gone, the yacht was gone, the fortune was gone, the great house was a blackened shell, and the island the family had ruled for 90 years now answered to the National Park Service. But the island was not empty. Something had been living in the seams of the Carnegie world for decades, multiplying quietly in the forest and along the dunes, while the people argued over who would own the sand. When the humans finally stepped back, it stepped forward. The horses were still there. Chapter 13. The Horses on Trial. Today the horses graze the lawns of Dungeness. They crop the grass that grows up through the ruined foundations. They stand in the shade of the blackened walls, and they wander the broken terraces and doorways where a steel fortune once wintered. It is the image that draws the crowds to the island now, the one on every postcard, wild horses grazing in the ruins of a Gilded Age palace. It is also, looked at closely, not quite the story it appears to be. The romance says the horses are ancient and Spanish, the descendants of mounts left behind by conquistadors in the 1500s, running free on the island for 5 centuries. It is a beautiful story, and it is not true. When geneticists from the universities of Georgia and Kentucky studied the herd in 1991, they found no Spanish Mustang in it at all. The horses of Cumberland are the feral descendants of ordinary American domestic breeds: Tennessee walkers and quarter horses, Arabians and Pasofinos, animals brought to the island at various times and then simply left behind. Among their ancestors were the more than 50 horses the Carnegies shipped over in the 1880s to pull their carriages and carry them on their hunts. The wild horses of Cumberland are not a relic of Spain. They are, in large part, what became of the Carnegies' carriage stock after the carriages, and the Carnegies were gone. And their freedom is not the idle it looks like from the ferry. Cumberland's horses are the only unmanaged herd on the entire Atlantic coast, which sounds like liberty and is closer to abandonment. They are given no food, no fresh water, no veterinary care, and no control over their own numbers. On a barrier island of salt marsh and thin forage, that is a hard way to live. A horse that is fed and doctored can live 25 or 30 years. A horse on Cumberland lives on average 9 or 10. The mares are almost always pregnant or nursing, and almost always underfed. They die of parasites, of drought, of disease, of the ordinary accidents of a wild animal with no one to tend it. The romantic herd in the ruins is, up close, a population of half-starved animals dying at a third of the age they might otherwise reach. They are also, by most expert accounts, bad for the island. They overgraze the dunes that hold the beach in place, they trample the marsh, and they crowd out the native and endangered creatures the seashore was created to protect. The Park Service has quietly removed other introduced animals over the years. It took the free-roaming cattle off the island in the 1980s, and it has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars clearing feral hogs. But it has never touched the horses, because the horses are the thing people come to see, and no agency wants to be remembered as the one that took the wild horses of Cumberland away. So, in April of 2023, someone tried to force the question. A coalition of horse welfare groups, a longtime island resident, and a conservationist filed a 65-page federal lawsuit demanding that the government finally manage or remove the herd, both for the island's sake and for the horses' own. In an unusual move, they named the animals themselves as plaintiffs. The suit was brought, in part, on behalf of the horses of Cumberland Island, and it argued that the government had left them for decades in what it called less-than-humane conditions. A federal judge dismissed the case the following year on narrow legal grounds, noting that the Park Service had, in fact, done nothing at all about the horses, which was rather the plaintiff's entire point. The horses are still there. What to do about them is still unanswered. Set the numbers side by side and the shape of it comes clear. Between roughly 150 and 170 horses, the only unmanaged herd on the Atlantic coast, fed and watered and doctored by no one. A life expectancy of 9 or 10 years against the 25 or 30 a cared-for horse can expect. More than 50 animals brought over by the Carnegies in the 1880s multiplied and gone wild across a century and a half. A genetic study that found Tennessee Walker and Arabian where the legend had promised Spanish Mustang, and a 65-page lawsuit filed on behalf of the horses themselves, dismissed, unresolved, still hanging over the island. This is what it means, in the end, to say that nature took the island back. Not a pristine wilderness reclaiming a ruin, but the abandoned livestock of a vanished fortune, running loose and breeding and dying among the walls that fortune built. The Carnegies brought the horses to serve the gilded life. The gilded life burned to the ground. The horses stayed and made the ruins their own, and became the last living remnant of the empire, half wild, half starved, and beyond anyone's control. The island took back the house, and the fortune, and the family. The horses it simply kept. Chapter 14. A Wedding and a Grave. On a September evening in 1996, the most famous young man in America was married on Cumberland Island in a one-room church with no electricity, built by the descendants of the island's enslaved people at the far north end from the burned palace of the Carnegies. Outside, along the beach, the wild horses ran. It was the last great secret the island ever kept, and one of the strangest weddings in American memory. The groom was John F. Kennedy, Jr., the son of a president shot dead in Dallas, and the bride was Carolyn Bessette, a fashion publicist from Connecticut. They were among the most photographed people in the world, and they wanted, more than anything, to be married where no camera could find them. They found the place on Cumberland. There was no bridge to the island, no way onto it but by private boat, and only one inn, the Grayfield, the colonial house Lucy Carnegie had built for her daughter, and that Lucy's descendants still run. The couple invited fewer than 40 guests, told them by word of mouth, gave the wedding a code name, and staggered their arrivals so that not one photographer learned of it in time. One organizer said afterward that pulling it off had taken the skill of James Bond and the whole CIA. On the evening of the 21st of September, by candlelight, in a church with 8 wooden pews and no power, John Kennedy and Carolyn Bessette were married, and the world found out only after it was over. They could have married anywhere. The reason they chose that particular church, at the poor and quiet north end of the island, reached back nearly 30 years. When Robert Kennedy, John's uncle, was assassinated in 1968, the deacon of the First African Baptist Church, a woman named Beulah Alberti, had gathered the island's small black community, the descendants of its freed people, and held a service in that little church in Bobby Kennedy's honor. Someone told John the story, and it moved him past changing his mind. And so the grandest name in American public life was married not in a Carnegie palace, all of them by then burned or sold or shut, but in the plain church that freed people had built with their own hands, at the opposite end of the island from everything the Gilded Age had raised. It was the brightest day of a short life. Less than 3 years later, in July of 1999, John Kennedy took off in a small plane he was flying himself, bound for a family wedding, with Carolyn and her sister aboard. The plane went down into the sea off Martha's Vineyard, and all 3 were killed. He was 38. The island that had held the happiest evening of his life outlasted him, as it had outlasted nearly everyone who ever set foot on it, believing the moment would last. And that, in the end, is what Cumberland is. It keeps its whole history at once, at opposite ends of 18 miles of sand. At the south end stand the ruins of Dungeness and the small walled cemetery where the Carnegies lie, near the Greens and the Millers and the empty grave of Light Horse Harry Lee. At the north end stands the little wooden church, and near it the graves of the freed people who built the one community on the island that was ever truly their own. Between them run the horses and the marsh and the old carriage roads going quietly back to forest. The island holds the palace and the church, the fortune and the people it was built on, the grand and the forgotten side by side, and it holds them the same way, which is to say, quietly, and for a very long time. Every family that ever set out to own Cumberland Island is gone from it now, or nearly so. The Greens, the Millers, the Staffords, the Carnegies, and for a single evening the Kennedys, all crossed it and passed on. 2 great houses burned to the ground on the same patch of sand, 93 years apart. The largest steel fortune in America could buy the island and raise a castle on it and lock it shut for half a century, and still could not keep the place any longer than the cotton barons or the revolutionary generals who came before. In the end, the island did to the Carnegies what it had done to all of them. It let them build, and it waited, and it took the whole of it back. The wild horses graze in the ruins of Dungeness now, and the tide comes in over a shore that belonged for 90 years to one of the richest families that ever lived. It belongs today to no one, and to everyone, and most of all to the island, which was never for sale.